Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Mina Bose. I'm the Executive Dean for Public Policy and Public Service Programs and the Director of the Peter S. Calico Center for the Study of the Presidency in the Calico School of Government, Public Policy, and International Affairs at Hofstra. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you here today for a special full day of programming with the common theme, American Constitutionalism at 250. That's celebrating the semi-quincentennial of the Declaration of Independence this year. How will the past inform the future? I'm going to turn it over to our distinguished panelists in just a moment to go over the specifics for today's most timely panel, No King, 1776 to 2026, Executive Power and the Decision for War. But I would be remiss if I didn't just take a moment here to recognize the faculty who have put together this program, the full day's events, starting with the previous session on presidential debates. We have 3 events here now, and all of this really originates with Dr. Carolyn Eisenberg in the history department, who proposed in the fall that it was very timely for this. So I just wanted to take the chance to thank Dr. Eisenberg, Dr. Labresco, who will be moderating a panel this afternoon, also organized one of the events. Dr. Fritz is on the Calico School Faculty Advisory Council, which is oversees a lot of the programming we've done today, and Dr. Linda Longmire in the Department of Geography and Global Studies, which is one of the Calico School departments, and has been a strong supporter and organizer of so many events this year and previously. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Longmire to introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, of course, as always, for the many events and programs and contributions that Dr. Bose makes to the university, as well as, of course, the Cultural Center, without whom nothing can happen on this campus. So always grateful for their help in envisioning and organizing so many events. You know, I'm thinking about something that I think it was Albert Einstein said. He had so many great quotes, not only in terms of his genius as a scientist, but he said something about, yeah, we have to remember the past, learn from the past, but we live in the present and we have to anticipate the future. But in all cases, what really counts is questioning, that we have to raise questions about past, present, and of course about the future. And then again, as we look particularly at this urgent panel today, in the midst of a hot war, to think about executive power and going to war with its enormous consequences, that quote's never been, I think, more relevant as we, look back the 250 years, the big journey that we've all been on together, and grounded, hopefully, in the present, but also really trying to think downstream to the enormous consequences, particularly in terms of executive power overall, but nowhere is that more important than in going to war. So we are particularly grateful for this panel today and really look forward to our sharing. What we'll do is have a short presentation from each of our 3 panelists, and of course I'll spend more time welcoming our guest, Etan Mabourakh, because of course most of you know of the great good works and the wonderful scholarship and organizing that's been done by my two wonderful colleagues. So first we will hear from the aforementioned Paul Fritz. Professor Paul Fritz is, not only does he do all of the things that Dr. Bose mentioned, he is also Speaker of the Faculty. He is our voice. He is also the Chair of Political Science. He is the advisor for the Peace and Conflict Studies program, in addition to being a superb teacher. He does international politics. So we are, as always, so grateful for all of his time, energy, and insight. So we'll first hear from Paul Fritz. Please join me in welcoming him. You guys want to speak from there or up here?
I'm fine. Here.
Do speak into the mic because we're recording it. And then later, when we open things up for your questions and comments, please remember to use the floor mics as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Longmire, for that very generous introduction. And thank you, Dr. Bose. Thank you, Dr. Eisenberg, and everybody else who had a big role in this. And as always, a big thank you to the Cultural Center for putting this together. So I want to echo a little bit of what Dr. Longmire said, that we're at an urgent time to understand these issues of constitutionality and war powers. But I think it's always a relevant issue. It's just right now it's exceptionally urgent because not only do we have the war in Iran, but we have military action in the Caribbean that is questionable at best. We had the military action of Venezuela that was taken earlier this year to depose Nicolas Maduro. We have threats of potentially some type of action in Cuba. So it is exceptionally urgent. I'm going to frame some of what I have to say about American constitutionalism and the use of military power squarely on Iran, because that is the biggest issue right now in my mind. About 40 days since the war started, about 3,000 people dead, over half civilians. Widespread devastation in Iran in all kinds of different ways. Several Gulf states have suffered significant damage from Iranian retaliatory attacks. And we've had tremendous economic cost inside the United States and beyond. The Brown University Cost of War Project is telling us that it's at least $10 billion, if probably more like $20 billion, in terms of the cost of the military action itself, and another $20 billion in cost to U.S. consumers resulting from higher oil prices that is driving up the price of everything that we buy. So the costs are really significant, and this is to say absolutely nothing about the potential long-term cost in terms of the effects on the Iranian people, the global economic system, what's left of the liberal international order, and America's role leading that system. In the context of the war, there's a ceasefire right now, but it's just that, it's a ceasefire. We're just not launching direct attacks on each other right now. But we still have the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz, along with the U.S. blockade of Iranian seaports, and a clear direct threat that violence could resume. We're still in a state of war, all right? Several thousand more U.S. service personnel are on their way to the region as we speak. So we're increasing military capabilities there. There is another round of talks between Iranian and American officials that is apparently in the works after the first round failed. But this morning we heard the Secretary of Defense warn of widespread devastation on all kinds of civilian infrastructure inside Iran should those talks fail. So war is very much still present. It is very much still a possibility that we could see escalation. In the context of today's panel and the theme of American constitutionalism, I want to ask, how do we get here? Right, constitutionalism, it is framed in that idea of constitutionalism. Constitutionalism implies rule of law, checks on power and authority, and all kinds of other important things. So what are the powers in our democratic system that gave the Trump administration the ability to wage this war? If we start with the Constitution, we know that, in fact, the power to declare war is vested in Congress, very clearly. Why? I'm going to just touch on this briefly because I think my colleague will have more to say about this. But the basic reason for this is that war is the most consequential thing a state can do in foreign affairs, period. So it has to be a collective decision. So we have this power vested in Congress, but we have a little bit of a split authority, right? The Constitution also says that the president, as commander-in-chief, has the ability to conduct war once it's declared, or to repel an armed attack if it is happening without a first declaration of war. And I mentioned that last part in the context of Iran, because this idea of responding to an armed attack is what is being used when people say things like we've been at war with Iran for 47 years and similar, in my mind, nonsensical things. It's an appeal to the idea that somehow Iran was an imminent threat to the United States and therefore the president was justified in launching a war on Iran without congressional authorization. The imminent threat type of argument, I think, falls apart pretty quickly, and I'd be happy to discuss that a little bit in Q&A if you like, but the idea that Iranian missiles, their naval capabilities, the potential of nuclear weapons down the road somehow directly threatened American national security today is quite a stretch. Not that those things are problematic, they certainly could be, right? But certainly the idea of an imminent threat is hard to justify. So in this context of this sort of split authority in war, returning to that, the president, and I think everybody would agree, has this ability to repel an attack, but it's really clear in the Constitution that the decision for war is supposed to be made in Congress. But we haven't done that since World War II. We have moved away from that system for a variety of different reasons. I won't go too much into this, but the Cold War certainly plays a role in this, in the introduction of nuclear weapons into international politics, where the speed of war was so quickened that the thought of authorizing war in a nuclear context was kind of hard to imagine. We have a slow accumulation of power in the presidency, especially in foreign policy, in what Arthur Schlesinger called the imperial presidency. But we also have, and I think this is an important point, Congress willingly abdicating a lot of its authority on foreign policy. Just as a quick aside, the Iraq War in 2003 was authorized by Congress by something called the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, or AMUF. That's not a declaration of war, but it does authorize the president to make war. And what it does really is say that, okay, if you decide to go to war, Mr. President, we're okay with that. That is Congress abdicating their constitutional duty to declare war and be supportive of war in that sense. So this is a long pattern, and it's a situation where the president, one person, has extraordinary decision-making power on the use of force. In the case of the War of Iran, I would say that it's exceptionally clear that this is what happened. There was no meaningful consultation with Congress, certainly no authorization from Congress in any way. So we have this situation where we have to ask, right, in this constitutional order based upon liberal democratic ideas where there's supposed to be checks and balances on power, where do those checks and balances reside today? I won't spend too much time on this, but one could be the War Powers Resolution of 1973. Sometimes you hear it referred to as the War Powers Act. This is intended as a mechanism to constrain presidential decisions on the use of military force. To quote from Section 2 of the resolution, its purpose is to, quote, ensure that the collective judgment of both the Congress and the President will apply to the introduction of United States armed forces into hostilities. Now, how is this supposed to work? In a quick version of this, in the absence of a congressional declaration or other type of authorization for the use of war, the president has to inform Congress of deployment of military forces that may face hostilities within 48 hours of that deployment. So that's sort of the reporting requirement. The next part of this, it says that without congressional approval, or in the form of a declaration of war or different type of authorization, a president must remove those military forces from hostilities within 60 days and then adds another 30 days for extrication purposes. But it doesn't really work like that in real terms. In fact, it doesn't generally work at all. It's only been really used effectively once. It's been threatened to be used many times. One reason that it doesn't really work this way is that presidents have never, since the introduction of the resolution in 1973, after introducing military forces abroad in hostilities, they've never said after 60 days, oh, wait, I didn't get congressional authorization, I better pull back. What in fact has to happen is Congress has to pass a resolution to be able to force the president to withdraw those forces. And there's various reasons that that's pretty difficult. So the War Powers Resolution in a lot of ways, and I think Dr. Eisenberg will talk more about it later, is pretty weak. Presidents have consistently claimed it's unconstitutional. That's never been tested in the court, but that claim has been common. But there are also just lots of ways to get around it. Just to give you an example, Congress was upset with Reagan's deployment of military forces to Lebanon in the 1980s. Partly because it wasn't being informed of what was going on, and the Reagan administration simply used the lack of definition of hostilities in the resolution to say that we don't have to report to you about this because they're not introduced into hostilities. They're in a peacekeeping operation. So presidents have different ways to get around this. But it's also weak for a couple of other reasons. Congress effectively has to act to enforce it, and it has to act in the context of the deployment of military forces and presumably military forces being in harm's way. And fearing rally around the flag effects, a lot of times Congress is hesitant to actually hold a vote because it's going to be painted like they're not supporting the troops during a time of danger. One more weakness that I'll point out comes from Louis Fisher, who is a constitutional scholar, and he goes further to claim that the World War Powers Act, in fact, enshrines a system that is exactly the opposite of what the Constitution intends. Think about the logic for a second of the War Powers Resolution. The president gets to deploy troops anywhere in the world engaged in hostilities for 60 days. How is that consistent with Congress having the ability to declare war and send troops abroad? For Fisher and others, it's not, right? It flips the constitutional order in a lot of ways, where it legitimizes the president's authority to be able to deploy troops around the world. Now, that's not to say the World War Powers Resolution is useless. We've seen Congress recently hold some votes on the War Powers Resolution related to the Iran war, and it's failed multiple times, basically along partisan lines. There is a promise by a group of Democratic senators to force a vote on this weekly, which they can do because of the way the War Powers Resolution is worded, but it's unlikely to pass until something changes. So we've got this system where the environment for decisions on war and peace have shifted. The main tool that Congress created to deal with this problem in the 1970s, the War Powers Resolution, is weak. And it seems clear to me and many other scholars that we have an imperial presidency where the president is fundamentally unconstrained when it comes to foreign policy and issues of war and peace, at least formally, because I think that there are other constraints that we have to think about that do reside in the constitutional system, even if they're not in the explicit constitutional order. One thing that is in the explicit constitutional order is kind of, for Congress, the nuclear option, and that would be cutting off funding for war. That is a really dramatic step that gets talked about a lot. It's probably really unlikely even in this context of a really unpopular war in Iran. But it's there. Congress has the power of the purse. Scholars have looked at other things, though, too, that are a little bit more subtle. I'm thinking of Howe and Peavy House and their work on the relationship between presidents and Congress when it comes to the use of force. And while their findings suggest partisanship really matters, they also point out that Congress has lots of tools of constraint that don't rise to the level of cutting funds or ending a war through the War Powers Resolution. Things like holding congressional hearings, trying to purposefully shape the media landscape, creating reporting expectations for the Department of Defense, for the State Department, for other agencies involved in the war effort. All of these things sort of can have, at least in the long term, or maybe medium term, some effect on perceptions of war over time. So they can act as a type of constraint. We also have a whole host of voter-driven models in the study of international relations that suggest the importance of public opinion when it comes to decisions related to this. Basically, they're median voter models where people assume that the average voter kind of wants security but without exorbitant cost. And this makes Democratic leaders sensitive to the potential of the public punishing them at the next election if they make bad decisions on war. Again, that's kind of a long-term constraint, but it is a way that elected elites, have to think about the impact of their decisions. People don't normally vote on foreign policy issues, but there are exceptions. In 2006, for example, when the Iraq war was going so poorly and was becoming very unpopular, the midterm election where the Republicans faced a big defeat was clearly a rebuke of George W. Bush's Iraq policy. And just in the context of Iran, the polling on the Iranian war right now suggests Trump is much deeper underwater with the Iran war than George W. Bush ever was in the context of the Iraq war. One more I'll add and then wrap up. There's also there's a new work by Elizabeth Saunders who looks at elites and decisions for war and peace. And elite sounds a little anti-democratic when we start talking about this kind of stuff. But we're talking about elites in the democratic system that are in legitimate positions. And what Saunders calls the insider's game is something where elected elites, especially those members of Congress, but also executive branch officials, put pressure on presidents to shape war policy in unseen ways to the public. And they do this largely, and they can get actual concessions on war policy by threatening the agenda of the larger political agenda of the president. We've seen this in the past. I'm going to go back to Lebanon again because I think it's an instructive case here. The Lebanon intervention in 1983 was not very salient to the public. People weren't thinking a whole lot about it. Elites were, and they did not like it. Especially when Republicans started to break with Reagan or threatened to break with Reagan and started to threaten his larger agenda regarding the buildup of nuclear weapons and other things, they essentially forced Reagan to withdraw, against his wishes, forced him to withdraw from Lebanon. So that unseen insider game sort of can work as a constraint. The reason I bring up these three in particular, because they all point back to one conclusion in my mind. Right? Whether it's elites, especially elected elites in Congress, or median voters influencing decisions before and during war, it all points back to something that I think is actually crucial to our constitutional order, and that it's us that can really eventually have some impact upon this type of thing. It might not, if you don't like the war in Iran, it might not mean that we can end the war in Iran today or tomorrow. Right? But the 2026 elections can shape elite perceptions of their possibilities of winning in 2026 or losing, which then could impact their support in what Saunders calls the insider's game for continued support for the Trump administration. So I think that while the constitutional order is effectively out of whack when it comes to war policy, and the actual constitutional tools that Congress and others have are weak, there are still mechanisms available for us to use to be able to constrain foreign presidential decision-making when it comes to war power. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's okay. That was good.
Thanks so much. We'll hear more about some of those things that can be done in a bit. But when you were talking about the role of elites, both in starting wars and stopping them, that's interesting. I always go back to this quote by Orwell, who said something about when, let's see if I have it, that that war against a foreign country only happens when the moneyed classes think they are going to profit from it, and that's perhaps the way they end. At least in one factor as well, but we'll talk more about that. Thank you so much, Paul. And now we'll hear from Professor Carolyn Eisenberg, who probably knows more about American foreign policy than anyone on this campus. You all know her as a wonderful teacher and scholar. She's the author of the award-winning book, Fire and Rain, about Vietnam, and which I'd highly recommend. You know, we need those lessons as well as we stretch back and try to figure out what has happened and what can be done. So, Professor Eisenberg,
Yes.
please.
Okay. Just remind me to keep speaking into the microphone.
Please remember that.
All right, so going back to September 1787, Benjamin Franklin was approached by Mrs. Elizabeth Powell, and the Constitutional Convention had just ended, and she wanted to know if the delegates had created a republic or a monarchy. And Franklin famously answered, "A republic, if you can keep it," by which he meant that if the citizenry was alert and engaged, the new government would survive. And if it was asleep, it might not. So we're, as Paul has been discussing, we're here, I think it's the 7th week of the undeclared war with Iran. And again, as Paul has been pointing out, there was no consultation with anybody. I mean, maybe Melania, right? So he didn't tell the Allies. Oh, he told the Israeli government. He did not tell the Allies. He did not tell Congress. He didn't even call members of Congress in to have a private conversation. And he didn't tell us. And for those of you who were riveted to his 2-hour State of the Union address, there was about 3 minutes on the subject of Iran. So this situation that we're in right now is linked to a much wider concern that we have in this country right now, which is of President Trump's radical departure from the Constitution and a real fear that our Republican government is disappearing. And that goes well beyond foreign policy. Now, none of that would have surprised our founding fathers, because they were afraid that our new government, based on consent of the governed, would revert to a monarchy, which is why, as Paul was saying, when they wrote the Constitution, a priority was Article 1, Section B, Clause 11. I hope you got that all down. Quote, the Congress shall have power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water, and to raise and support armies, right? So that's Article 1, Section A. And in contrast to what Congress is able to do, the president can function as commander-in-chief once Congress declared war. Now, as Paul's been, we overlap a lot. I think we 90% agree, which does not always happen. But this division of powers was not a casual thing. For the founding fathers, the decision for war was one of the most profound decisions the government could make. And if it became an executive function, which was something that had happened in other societies in the past, it would grant one man far too much power. Or to quote James Madison, the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. War expands executive power, creates secrecy, and weakens liberty. So many of these things that he's talking about we are experiencing right now. Since the legislative branch was closest to the people, Madison believed there'd be greater caution by Congress in rushing into armed conflict. For Jefferson, George Washington, James Madison, and their colleagues, the decision for war was too serious a matter to be left in the hands of one man. And probably many of you heard Donald Trump saying recently that the only limits on his use of military force is, quote, my own morality, which is very reassuring, my own mind. It's the only thing that can stop me. This is exactly what the founding fathers wanted to avoid. So, and as I really have the same question that Paul does. How did we get from there to now? How has it happened that our Congress has not declared war since 1942, and yet we've been at war much of the last 80 years, and some of those wars even lasting over a decade? So one simple answer to that is that since World War II, why have we always been at war? Presidents have found it quicker and easier to look for ways around Article 1. And from the time of Korea through the Vietnam War, they had ways of working around that imperative. The case of Vietnam had particular significance. In August 1964, President Johnson reported that U.S. ships had been attacked in international waters by North Vietnamese boats. Everything about this report was either misleading or a flat-out lie. However, based on this inaccurate information, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which authorized the president, quote, to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. At the time that Congress passed this resolution, it was seen as limited, with less than 20,000 U.S. military personnel in the area. On that legal basis alone, the Johnson administration increased the American presence to 550,000 troops. By the time that project was over, there were 58,000 dead American soldiers, 3 to 4 million dead Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians, and massive destruction of the land and the buildings and the institutions all across those countries. There was nothing in the authorization that prefigured anything of the kind. And just in terms of destruction of the land, when I was writing my book, one of the things that I was asked to be driven across the Osho Valley in the middle of Vietnam, which was an area of intense fighting. You know, decades and decades later, that land was ruined, as far as the eye could see. That this was land that the U.S. had dropped chemicals on, it was unusable, et cetera. And we go to Cambodia and Laos, where there's all unexploded ordnance, that still remains the case today. So by 1973, the Vietnam War was over, and it was widely recognized as a catastrophe for almost all parties. The misuse of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was well understood, and the urgent need to reassert the power of Congress over the decision for war that had to happen. And Paul has been speaking about the War Powers Act that was passed in November of 1973 over Nixon's veto, and it was designed to reclaim its authority over the decision for war. And this is repetition, but maybe it's worth a moment, which is, so the president had to formally notify Congress within 48 hours of deploying troops and specified that military action had to end in 60 days unless authorized by Congress. It also stipulated that by concurrent resolution, Congress can require U.S. troop withdrawal before the 60 days are up. But despite the high expectations that accompanied this resolution, as a practical matter, I think we agree, it proved relatively useless in reducing the American propensity for war or the curbing of presidential overreach. There's several reasons for that, but one major point is that according to the resolution, the president has 60 days to deploy military power, even without congressional consent, right? In other words, unless Congress specifically says you have to withdraw, the president can go on. But you need to notice that there's one little caveat again, which is that Congress can, by concurrent resolution, within those 60 days, if they vote, both houses vote that the troops have to leave, the president has a responsibility to leave. So there's that little piece of it. So that to bring this back to Iran and the impact of U.S. actions, because this matter of who decides to begin wars has real-life implications. During 40 days of warfare, the U.S., together with Israel, what do we know about what happened in Iran? And Paul has spoken about some of this. American planes struck Tehran, a city of 90 million people, with thousands of bombs. The White House claimed they were hitting military targets, perhaps. But these bombs were dropped in densely populated residential neighborhoods. According to human rights activists, at least 1,700 civilians were killed. Students, teachers, healthcare workers. On the very first day of the war, American missiles hit an elementary school, many of you know that, in southern Iran. It killed 175 people, mostly kids. And you know, horrible scenes where their parents come to the school to pick up the kids, and the kids are dead, and the building is in ruins. One of the most horrifying things you could imagine. Secretary of Defense Hegseth claimed that the Iranian government had struck the school, that they had bombed the school, which was ridiculous, and proved to be a lie because it emerged that it was an American Tomahawk missile that blew up the school. And by the way, there's not been any investigation about how that all came about. The list of horrors goes on. In the Iranian city of Longmire, a US-made ballistic missile hit a sports hall, an adjacent elementary school, and a blood transfusion center, which happened to be near a military facility. The sports hall, at the time that the US bombed it, was being used for a girls' volleyball team at the time of attack. The list of Iranian targets goes on. Hospitals, forced to evacuate patients, some newborn babies on incubators, other adults who were in the ICU. So how in the world did all that happen? Actually, the New York Times said at least 22 schools and 17 healthcare facilities were damaged by the American and Israeli government. Did Iran attack the United States? Did it threaten the United States? Did Congress authorize this war? Were there any Middle East experts who thought this was needed? The answer to all these questions is an obvious no. As best we can determine, the Israeli leader, Netanyahu, convinced the president that overthrowing the Iranian government would be an easy win. And apparently President Trump was convinced, plus another opportunity to be the center of attention. So how could this happen? How is it possible that this killing might yet continue when, according to the polls, 2/3 of Americans have no interest in this project? And I would imagine that's true of 2/3 of the people in this room. So historians are going to be busy writing dissertations forever. But here are some of the factors that the Founding Fathers did not envision, and this is not exhaustive. One, the creation of vast national security bureaucracies inside the executive, whose primary focus is the conduct of war. Two, billion-dollar businesses who profit from the sale of weapons, with thousands of communities across the country, including some in Long Island, who depend on these companies for employment. Three, the tremendous impact of money on elections. The Founding Fathers thought that the legislative branch would be closer to the people and their aspirations. They didn't foresee how the introduction of unchecked expenditures would produce a degree of partisanship that would inhibit public control. And finally, and I want to really emphasize this, they didn't predict the impact of distractions, multiple distractions, and how that would limit public attention or engagement with matters of war and peace. I can't emphasize that enough. They were imagining an engaged, informed citizenry, especially when it came to questions of war and peace. And they had no idea about how people would be able to tune out. They didn't know about Instagram and all these, all of TikTok and all the other things. So I want to sort of close by clarifying this last point about distraction with an example from yesterday and today. You might remember, I think, as Paul mentioned, and I also just reiterated, really, that if the president initiated a war without congressional consent, at any point, members of the House and Senate could invoke that act and ask for a vote and require that he immediately stop the war. What has been happening for the last several weeks is that congressional Democrats have invoked that act to require that the president stop. The Senate voted on that yesterday and defeated the measure by a vote of 52 to 47, essentially along party lines. It was a very, very close vote. While we're sitting here now, the House of Representatives is expected to vote today on H-Con Res 40, Iran War Powers Resolution, directing the president, pursuant to Section 5C of the War Powers Resolution, to remove United States armed forces from hostilities with Iran. That's what the resolution says. Probably going to come up this afternoon. It might fail by a narrow margin. At least 2 of our Long Island representatives will vote against it. There are thousands of, and it's worth really thinking about it. First, ask yourself the question, how many people are paying attention to that? It's a very, very important vote, right? Even though it's not binding, which is a point that Paul is making, it's a very important vote that's going to take place because involved in that are the life and death of American troops, of Iranian civilians, of hospitals, of schools, etc. So this isn't like some little boring thing that's going on, right? It's not about, just minor things about the transportation system. It is very major, right? And there are thousands of Long Island voters here on our campus, right? But how many were paying attention? And it's really a serious question because I think if you ask the question, how many people on our campus right now, and I know it's not everybody, and there are divisions of opinion and so forth, but how many people on this campus right now really want the U.S. to be at war with Iran? And to what extent are our Long Island representatives hearing anything about that? So that bill is going to fail by a narrow margin with at least 2 of our representatives voting against it. How do we explain that? So, if you ask yourself, what did James Madison and his colleagues expect when they wrote the Constitution of the United States? He believed that if they believed that if the country was going to war, that ordinary citizens would care enough to make their voices heard. Thank you.
Great. So speaking of voices being heard, I'm really delighted to welcome our next speaker, who has not been to Hofstra before, I don't think. So I want to give you a little more background about his work. Some of you may know I love the quote by Gramsci, which says, "We have to cultivate pessimism of the mind, but optimism of the will." And Etan Mabourakh, I think, embodies that, raising critical questions, but walking the talk as an activist, as an advocate. He is a Jewish, Iranian, American, some cultural intersectionality. He's a community organizer. He's an advocate for the Iranian American diaspora. He's the organizing manager of the National Iranian American Council, NIAC, and is also a board member of the Brooklyn for Peace. So his work is at the intersection of anti-war organizing, civil rights, as well as immigrant justice. He's been involved in many grassroots mobilizations across the country. And you might have seen him on CNN or quoted in the New York Times and other media because he is very much bringing the Iranian American perspective into these international conversations about war diplomacy and the diaspora rights. He's been involved in community organizing in response to the targeting of some Iranian Americans by ICE, as well as concerned, obviously, about the war. He has worked on this war powers resolution that we've been discussing, which is our, kind of desperate effort to reassert congressional authority over the use of military force. And so, again, he is someone who walks the talk. And in both of our prior talks, we've heard about, well, what can be done, what can be done, what can be done. And so we're delighted that Etan Mabourakh is here to help us think about some of the many things that can be done by us. Etan, welcome to Hofstra.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Well, thank you, everyone. I want to start off just by telling you a little bit about what I do. I organize with volunteers. I try and work with Iranian American, mostly Iranian American volunteers, but we don't discriminate. Work with all sorts of Americans, veterans, and the like. Anyone who wants to step up in their community and get involved on these issues. And on a daily basis, since the June war, frankly, but especially in these recent weeks, I've had people calling me and texting me, terrified about their family, about their loved ones in Iran, and asking, what can we do? And it's my organization's position, it has been our position for 20 years, NIAC's been around for 20 years, to advocate for diplomacy with Iran and negotiations, not because we support the Iranian government. We do not support the Iranian government, but because we believe in diplomacy as the only viable solution to so many of these problems that we've discussed: the nuclear question, war breaking out with Iran, and human rights for Iranians there. So I want to focus on a few key points in the last year and a half that I think are really illuminative. The first, right, the June war, the 12-day war, which saw over 1,000 Iranians killed, and saw President Trump very forcefully claim victory, claim that he had obliterated Iran's nuclear program. And that press statement is still up on the White House website. You can go look at it. So every time you hear Secretary Hegseth or Vice President Vance or President Trump claim that Iran is an imminent nuclear threat, just go refer yourself to their own statements from last year claiming victory. And I also want to impress the idea that acts of war are not simply limited to strikes. Included in acts of war are blockades. So even right now, amidst this 2-week ceasefire, which is closely nearing its end and hopefully not, but possibly another resumption and escalation, the United States is attempting to blockade the blockade that the Iranians have put on the Strait of Hormuz, and that is an act of war. Additionally, imposing sanctions on a country, cutting them off from the global economy, cutting them from their ability to sell oil or to import medicine is also an act of war. We're seeing it in Cuba, but the same has been true for Iran. Ever since the United States pulled out of our diplomatic agreement with the Iranians. Many of you may know this, but President Obama negotiated the Iran nuclear deal, otherwise known as the JCPOA. The core tenets of that deal were unprecedented access, inspection of Iran's nuclear sites, opening up to international inspectors to view them, to make sure they were not enriching above a point towards weapons grade, but that they were enriching for domestic energy use purposes. And that is every right of any country who has signed on to the Non-Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, which Iran is a signatory to. Now, President Trump pulled out of that deal, and that deal was not unanimously popular within Iran. There are hardline voices in Iran who have advocated for military confrontation, for getting the nuclear bomb, and for dismissing negotiations with the West. There are also advocates and people in Iran who disagree, who've pushed for diplomacy. And when I think you analyze our policies and our basic goals, it's important to take those into account and to take into account what signals an American administration is sending with our actions. And so you can look back to October of 2025 as sort of the last nail in the coffin to bury that deal. And that was when the Europeans implemented snapback sanctions on Iran. Shortly after, in December, there were mass protests from Iranians, initially triggered by economic collapse, mismanagement, and corruption from their government. Those protests remained largely peaceful in the initial weeks. People were making demands of the government, as is their right. Now, those protests quickly spiraled into one of the most historic violent crackdowns against the Iranians that we've seen in recent years. The confirmed death toll is around 7,000. But the president has cited much larger figures in referencing that crackdown. He's cited close to 40,000, and that figure is not substantiated. But regardless of what figure you choose, it was one of the most historic, brutal crackdowns against the Iranians in history. And that was used in part to argue that this war was initially a humanitarian rescue mission. Trump tweeted, "Help is on the way." He called for Iranians to seize their institutions, to take to the streets in the initial days of this war. He's abandoned all of that rhetoric since. You cannot find a recent statement of him talking about this war in any way as beneficial to the people of Iran. In fact, his most recent statements before this ceasefire, calling for the destruction of entire civilization, really go down as one of the most horrific statements uttered by a president in history, a blatantly genocidal statement. And so, NIAC, my organization, we try and represent Iranian Americans. It's roughly a million or so, maybe 1.2 million Iranian Americans in the United States. No community is a monolith. People don't agree on everything. And we did polling. We commissioned with Zogby Analytics a poll of Iranian Americans, two of them, one at the beginning of the war and another a few weeks in. At the beginning of the war, it found that it was basically 50-50 split among the community, that 49.4% disapproved of the war, 48% approved of the war. After a few weeks, right, after people saw that first day double tap strike on the Minab Elementary School, strikes on additional schools, strikes on oil depots that saw oil raining down from the sky, bombs on historically cultural protected UNESCO World Heritage sites in Iran. There are thousands of them. and at least 52 historically protected cultural heritage sites were bombed, including Golestan Palace, where the previous Shahs were coronated. People have changed their opinion, and the second poll that we did saw a shift towards close to 70% disapproval in the community of the war. And it's because people see that this is not a humanitarian mission. It is a war in an attempt to collapse an entire civilization, a state. And so we've been trying to respond as advocates, and the war powers resolutions have been one of the key tools for Americans to push back on this. I've been involved in several war powers fights in my career. One of the more, I want to point to some successful examples to give you some hope. In 2019, Congress passed through both chambers a war powers resolution on Yemen. Trump vetoed it, but that was a significant step. It was one of the few times that one has been passed through both chambers, and it really affirmed the coalition of groups, the many groups that want to push and advocate on this. More recently, there was a war powers resolution passed on Venezuela in the Senate. It saw 5 Republican senators vote for it, and that significantly changed Trump's calculus in how he conducted that operation. We still are hoping to pass a war powers resolution on Iran to restrain him further. But we hold on to those examples with great hope, and there are hundreds of veterans, of faith-based advocates, of Jewish advocates like myself, of Iranians, of anti-war voices who are really engaged in Washington, D.C. and around the country. And like Professor Eisenberg said, you all can play a role in this by watching what your lawmakers do, calling their offices, emailing them, and being an informed and engaged citizen. You are their boss. They are not your boss. You have every right to organize and to put basic questions to them. And I would encourage you to see how they vote today in the Iran War Powers Resolution and give them a call and tell them how you think, as is your right as an American. And unfortunately, it seems like, we talked about the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. We are way far away from any of that, and I've listened to scholars categorize what we're in now as an escalation trap, as a situation where unless we make concessions, clear concessions, we're going to be fixed in a situation that we can't get out of, because the incentives for the Iranians are different for what they are for us. For this Iranian government, this war is completely existential, and they have shown a willingness to murder their own citizens and pay extreme costs for survival. And I think the question remains of whether or not Trump is willing to put us all as Americans through similar costs. We're seeing gas prices spiral if this continues. We're seeing attacks on U.S. bases in unprecedented ways. The attack on the base in Kuwait, which injured hundreds of U.S. soldiers and killed at least 6. I know 13 U.S. service members have been killed so far in this war. Those are significant, and those are costs that are going to continue to mount. And the War Powers Resolution is a quick way to provide a political off-ramp, frankly, for Trump and for other, even Republicans, who are going to have to go home every month and be asked questions by their constituents about this war for as long as it continues. And I'd like to also note another vote that also happened yesterday. There have been, for several years now, bills put forth by Senator Bernie Sanders called Joint Resolutions of Disapproval. These bills, the most recent one proposed to ban 2,000-pound bombs, 1,000-pound bombs, and bulldozers, the sale of bulldozers to the Israeli government. Those bills, frankly, if anyone had proposed them 5 years ago, they would have been laughed out of the room in Congress. You would have been branded possibly an anti-Semite and kicked out of the room. But now, as of the vote last night, 40 Democratic senators voted in support of those bills. A massive jump from the last few votes, which saw 27 and 19 senators voting for them. That's the result of sustained pressure of groups organizing letters, of groups organizing meetings, not just protests, dignified engagement, where you're trying to have conversations with the staff members of your members of Congress, where you're trying to explain to them why you want this. You're giving them the carrot and the stick in this process. And it's an unprecedented shift in American politics and a willingness to restrain our military, our imperial, violent actions. So I would encourage you to just pay attention to these fights. They're ongoing. They're literally today and last night. These votes are taking place, and there's no barrier to entry for anyone to have an opinion, whether you disagree or agree. You can get involved in these advocacy groups. You can reach out to your own member of Congress. You can organize with your fellow students. And I'll give just one last example of this. The vote that is going on as we speak right now in the House, the Iran War Powers Resolution. Congress, before this week, was on a 2-week recess. They took a break. And before they took that break, there was also an opportunity for House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries and House Foreign Affairs Committee ranking member Gregory Meeks to bring that same resolution to the floor for a vote. They claimed they did not have the votes to pass it. Advocates were pushing them to call for a vote regardless, because between the time that they could have taken that vote and the last War Powers resolution, which had been voted on, at least 2 Republicans and 3 Democrats who had voted no flipped and said they would vote yes. So advocates like myself and other groups were pushing them to bring this to the floor for a vote. We had been asking them. When they didn't do that, when the week came and went and we knew Congress was going to be out for another 2 weeks with no opportunity to take a vote to press the administration, I and others organized a press conference in front of Hakeem Jeffries' office. And we very politely pressured him, called him out. And I'm very glad to see that this War Powers resolution is being voted on today. And after having called him out a few weeks ago, I'm now going to be writing him a thank you message and working with others to try and support the vote. So this is the kind of approach and engagement you can all take. The word lobbying actually originates from the practice of people used to hang out in the lobby of the White House and just try and get a meeting with the president. So I really hope you look at these issues as complex as some people try to make them, without a veneer of complexity. You're all engaged, articulate people. You can have an opinion. You can do your own research and get involved. And conversations like this are really helpful for it. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Etan. It's really what I like to call political fitness, that sense of becoming aware, becoming engaged, and being able to be empowered enough to make a difference and see in a democracy, what a difference that can make. So thank you so much for your political fitness and for your inspiration. It's so important that we not just be paralyzed by, how overwhelming these issues are. And so in that spirit, would love to hear from some of you, students particularly. Students we always hear from first. You're paying the big bucks. And so please use the mics, though, because we're recording things. And I'm very, very eager to hear your questions, reactions, comments, etc. Please.
Good afternoon. My name is Rayhan Dot. Mind if I take this out for a second?
Yeah, that's fine.
Appreciate it, thank you. My name is Rayhan Dadka. I'm a political science student. I'm originally from Afghanistan. I was born in the United States. My family immigrated from Afghanistan in the 80s. So my family lived in Iran for many years. I know some people, some of my family members and distant relatives that still live in Iran. And there was a couple things I wanted to touch base on what everyone said. First of all, since 1993, we've seen advocation from Benjamin Netanyahu to attack Iran. Since 1993, he's consistently said either Iran's a year away, 2 weeks away, days away, or months away from developing a nuclear weapon. It's been 30 years, and we still haven't seen any sign of that. As you said in the June war, that allegedly all nuclear capabilities were destroyed in Iran. So why are we still attacking Iran? I also think that when the war originally started, we saw that not just Mabourakh school was destroyed and bombed and 170 children were killed, but we've seen that day and the days leading after it and the weeks after it, we've seen almost 2,000 civilians being killed. And when we see the Iranian government, we saw Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, he was killed along with his family, certain members of the family, and so many other officials were killed. But President Trump said he doesn't want regime change, but then he said the regime changed. He said that he didn't want this to be a long war. He wanted it to be short, quick, and effective. We're not seeing short, quick, or effective. We're seeing that realistically, that is just a extension of what we've seen over the past 20 years on U.S. foreign involvement, and we're seeing the murder and death of so many civilians. And this has been consistent with what Benjamin Netanyahu has wanted. We see the current annexation of southern Lebanon, which just about an hour ago I found out that the last bridge connecting southern Lebanon to the rest of Lebanon was destroyed, which effectively annexes southern Lebanon, and Israel has taken over. So we're seeing that, and it's so unfortunate because we see former Secretary of States like Anthony Blinken and John Kerry. They also said that Benjamin Netanyahu has been advocating for an attack on Iran through every single administration the past 20 years, and that no one gave in until President Trump. But we're also seeing that why is a foreign leader like Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu dictating what goes on in our country and what we decide? I think that's a very unfortunate thing as an Afghan American. As an Afghan American, I saw the same thing happen in Afghanistan. We saw it in Iraq. We saw it across Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Sudan, Somalia. I can go on, and it's so unfortunate, realistically. And I think that there needs to be awareness to the fact that, unfortunately, the Israeli prime minister is dictating what goes on with U.S. policy and U.S. politics. And it's unfortunate because we're seeing people like that in charge, and it's affecting our current government and killing civilians in the process. Thank you.
Thank you. We have good students.
Okay. Lots of points. No, they're good questions. Good, and I think things worth thinking about. One thing that two things that I'll just mention. When you're right about the civilians being killed, there's no doubt about that. The regime change issue. It was clear that they wanted regime change and failed, right? So that's why it's off the table now in that sense. But it's abundantly clear, and even things he said after the first week of the war, Trump made it was clear that he wanted a type of regime change. The nuclear issue, Iran still has 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, which could be the basis of 10 nuclear bombs if it's further enriched, and that would take at least a year, if not more. So there's capability, but it's the whole point of the Iran deal was to be able to have at least a year of breakout capability where you'd be able to detect where Iran was going to create a bomb and have a year to respond to it. I mean, that's Iran is closer today to a nuclear bomb than it was in 2018 when the Trump administration pulled out. So that was a big cell phone in a lot of ways. The final point that I'll get to in sort of this question about sort of Benjamin Netanyahu dictating to Trump. I think that Benjamin Netanyahu just got lucky. He finally got a president who was willing to go along with this. But I wouldn't call it dictating in a sense. I don't think it was George W. Bush dictated to Tony Blair to join the war in Iraq. I think there was a confluence of interest in that regard, where Trump, probably being fed by his Secretary of Defense these stories about how quick and easy it would be to win this war, thought that he could do this super quickly and magically take care of this Iran problem that he's imagined has been around since 1979. So in that regard, I think Netanyahu finally got lucky in that regard. And Trump, and the reason I think that it's really important to say that is that Trump owns this war. He made the decision to do this, right? And he, whether you like it or not, he deserves credit for this war and making that decision. And I think that if we phrase it, if we think that it's an Israeli decision, then that actually reduces his culpability in that. And I think he's fully culpable for this decision. So excellent points, Rayon. Thank you. And
I think you're next, and then here, and then there. I think that was the order.
Hi, I'm Emma, and I took Professor Eisenberg's debating history class last semester, which focused on the Afghanistan and the Iraq War. And throughout this whole presentation, I've been noticing that there's a lot of comparisons between the Iraq War and the war that is currently going on. Could you talk about more of the comparisons, especially between Bush and Trump and their advisors?
Historical question. Do you want to address it, Rusty?
Maybe we should look, here's the range, I'm just looking at the time.
Okay.
So we could get the range of things and then, respond.
It's a
Of course,
good-
I have a lot to say, you'll be amazed.
It's a very good question, though, to try to look historically. Yes, let's go here and then back to you.
Oh, sorry. Hi, my name is James. I'm one of Professor Eisenberg's students. I've been for a couple of years now. And I had two questions kind of on the political climate that America is in. I saw that you guys kept mentioning topics of, citizenry being engaged and educated, historical fitness. But based off that topic, I had kind of a couple of questions and wanted to see what you thought. First of all, you briefly mentioned it too, how this is affecting the United States. Gas prices are rising. But that was kind of making me think about the disparity in what matters to us and what actually hits home to Americans versus what's mattering to the people that are affected. Elementary schools are being blown up and bombed, but a lot of Americans are just starting to care about this war because gas prices are raising by $1. Yeah. And that kind of played in, at least to what you guys are saying about an engaged citizenry. Do you think there's a way to kind of, I guess, solve that? Obviously, there are different perspectives among Americans, and there are also, this might not be your area of expertise because this is a foreign policy panel, but what do you think could be done to kind of increase that awareness and maybe that empathy amongst Americans? Now, the second question I had, I know it's a little bit long, but it's something I'm always thinking about. It's how close we are to midnight, how close we are to a nuclear war potentially ending the world. Now, you spoke about how this war was, or this attack, not a war, was waged to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, which we talked about how it's false. But I also worry about how people, citizens and world leaders may start to misunderstand what they're dealing with in terms of nuclear weapons. It's been 80 years since a nuke has been willingly used, intentionally used on human beings. I think most people here thinking about that can agree that that's a miracle that we've lasted that long. But I'm worried that in that time span, people have forgotten about the threat of it. That Cold War era, that tension is kind of fading into history, fading into the past, and it's not in the memory of people, maybe even world leaders. And a consequence of that is that people may not be as careful when using and talking about the use of nuclear weapons. So I know that was a lot to cover as well, but I would love to hear what you think about those.
Great questions. Etan, do you want to address that?
Sure. Yeah. Well,
Sorry.
No. Well, on the question of awareness and empathy, I agree and share your frustration that it doesn't take the immediate moral failing to get people involved. But one thing that pops up for me is that Congress snuck in the last National Defense Authorization Agreement a provision that we now have a automatic draft for people. And that is something, initially, when I would think about it, I was opposed to. But now when I really think about it, just the fact that people now have to be engaged and really take a thinking to when our nation goes into war, because it will cost them, because it'll affect them and their loved ones and their children who may be drafted or serving. I think you have to get really direct with this. Whatever works to get people engaged is what works. You don't have to get someone involved in the perfect way. Frankly, these No Kings protests that have been happening, many leftists, many organizers, many people involved have taken issue with them being unspecific and not totally focused. I actually found the last round of them to be very focused and organized. And even so, those types of actions bring people into the fold who've never been politically involved before, and then can be a jumping off point for them getting organized with local groups, with mutual aid, with political causes. So I would just say you got to meet people where they are. It's better to have them in than out. And to have a real big tent democracy, we have to have room for everyone, and you have to meet people with grace and patience. But push them. Don't compromise on what you care about. You know, it's a balance, but it can be struck, and we need people to do it. On the nuclear proliferation issue, I have long been a strong advocate for diplomacy. I'm one of those people who thinks the U.S. should have negotiations with every country, regardless of what we think of them, that we should have a full understanding and capacity for them. But the problem with our actions is that we just keep giving countries reasons to get the bomb. I don't want any country to have the bomb. But when you look at what happened in Libya when they gave up their nuclear program and what happened to the leader, there's now an incentive for countries to pursue those kinds of weapons. So, and even Professor John Mearsheimer argues openly that the world would be a safer place if Iran sought a nuclear weapon. I don't know if I agree with that, but I think these are important questions, and you have to ground them in the reality of incentives. Can we offer better incentives through diplomacy than through war? Because the incentives we've offered now have not yielded the results we want.
Yeah. I think in so many ways, isn't it that question about, how we move away from a culture of distraction? Remember this book, what was it called? Distracting Ourselves to Death or something. And really face the realities of things. It's kind of what I was saying before about pessimism of the mind. You have to think critically, but you can't get paralyzed. You have to act, and that's a hard thing for Americans to do, I think. But that's why education's important. Great questions. Thank you. Onward. Did you guys want to add anything?
I'm trying to evade talking about Iraq and Iran. Unless everyone want to stay here for 3 more hours. So let's take some more questions. I actually will come back to that.
You can always jump back in.
I heard that question. Go back.
All right, so my name's Gabe. I'm also in Professor Eisenberg's foreign policy class. And my question is mainly for Etan, because, we're both Jewish Americans. It's true that a lot of the, we've seen a significant increase in the amount of Democratic senators who voted to, block things like bulldozers and bombs. But a lot of these senators and a lot of elected officials, unfortunately, still support Israel as a whole and take this stance of, I'm just going to read off a quote I found from the Guardian. Being a stalwart friend of Israel, however, does not mean agreeing with all decisions of the Israeli government or Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Just like being a patriot of the United States does not require unquestioning agreement with the policy decisions of President Trump and his administration. and this was from California Senators Adam Schiff and Alex Padilla. So I'm just sort of wondering, given everything we've seen in Iran that the Israeli government military has done, not to mention everything over the last few years since October 7th, should elected officials really be supporting military aid to Israel at all, period? Given how much the public disapproves of Israel, disapproves of military aid to Israel. Yeah, I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Comment on that?
Great.
Who's one?
It was directed to
I think it's directed to me. Yeah, I think at this point, this is my personal opinion. I do not think we should be giving military aid to Israel. I think the important role for the United States is a diplomatic role. That it's not that we abandon Israel or that we have no concern for the security of the people there. I think as part of our government policy, it's appropriate to be concerned about the security of the people there, but it is also appropriate to be concerned about the security of the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. And despite what's claimed now, because the president thinks he's already settled 9 different conflicts, including this one, the situation in both of those places right now, in Gaza and the West Bank, is absolutely horrific. And even, on basic things that probably every person in this room agrees to, right? Like getting baby formula in, getting medicines in, getting people who are ill and seriously ill in Gaza, saving them, right? All those things aren't happening right now, right? And so at this point, for the U.S. to keep giving more military aid to Israel seems to me a totally wrong thing. And even though, people could argue with it, I don't think it's in the best interest of Israel. As one of the things is, as a Jewish person, that I grew up in a synagogue, with Holocaust concerns, and I was making trees for Israel and all those things. When Israel seemed to stand, in some extent it was built on misinformation, but to the extent that Israel stood for humanistic values, that was really meaningful. But that's not the situation we're in right now. And until it changes, I don't think we should be giving military assistance.
Yeah, I would just add that I also was raised extremely culturally Jewish. I went to Jewish day school. I traveled to Israel 6 times. I have family living there. But the fundamental questions of safety and security for Jewish people in that land are interlinked with the crimes committed by that government, specifically the crime of occupying land that's not theirs, and war crimes and aggression. The crime of aggression is also a crime. To attack another country that does not pose you a threat is a crime. And Benjamin Netanyahu has long sought a regional reformation plan. He's written about it. I'm escaping the name of it now, but it's long been a strategy to remake the region in an image that he would like, rather than address those fundamental problems that still exist in that land. And I don't think that our continued blank check provisions help that problem.
Great. Chris?
Hi. I just had a question on how we should go about making sure we stay updated on everything, because a lot of the times it can seem like there's too much going on. Making sure that we stay updated on the genocide in Palestine, the war in Iran, the Epstein files, making sure we hold people accountable. It can seem like a lot, just staying not distracted in the first place. How do we make sure we pay attention to everything?
Well, I would encourage you to follow independent journalists who do not have corporate backing, and because by and large they give it to you straight. They are biased too, and many journalists are biased, and you should take their bias into account. But a few good ones that I follow are Zateo News, Dropsite News, the Minan Agency on Iran, and there are advocacy groups like A New Policy that do great work on Palestine. The IMEU does great work as well, and NIAC keeps a newsletter called Iran Unfiltered and a human rights tracker if you're interested.
I will just make a plug for traditional media to some extent, as long as you're balancing it out and just seeking out. When I say traditional media, I am not talking about cable news. That's useless. But we're talking legitimate sources, whether it's BBC, which has all kinds of different options, and reputable sources. It is hard, though. I mean, Chris, you're pointing out the exact problem. I have that. I professionally, my job is to know what's going on.
It's hard.
And it's overwhelming right now. That's part of the point, though, there's a strategy to overwhelm the American people going on right now with one thing after another.
Yeah.
And the best thing that you can do, in my opinion, is to fight that tooth and nail, even if we're not, it sort of feels like a losing battle to stay informed. You just got to do your absolute best.
I actually want to come in on this. So we teach foreign policy, and we're troubled that we don't really know everything or even what we should be knowing. This is not a little problem, how to stay informed. I also would say, from the perspective of my old age, that this is one of the most challenging times we have ever lived in. There are so many changes that are taking place domestically and internationally that are truly dangerous and not in the best interest of any of us. So when you start listing all the things, what do I do? I think one thing that to me makes sense is you can't know about everything, unless you want to ruin your life. But what you can do is, I think if you feel that things that you do would make a difference, and that's really a generational thing, that well, yes, there are things that you can do. And if that's in your mind that you could be effective in some one of these arenas that you particularly see as critical, if you have that in your mind that you could really make a difference, I think it would also steer you to learning the things that you need to learn in order to go forward. So maybe that's a Pollyanna, answer, but this is a very, very challenging time. And the conversation we're having here is, whatever side people are on, this is really an important conversation.
It's so important that I wish we could continue it, but I'm getting the time signal from the back of the room. Can this be a really fast question? We always try to do the students first. Sorry.
No, it's not fast.
It's not fast. None of this is fast, I know.
I have a fast. Mine's not really a question. Mine is that I've been to all the rallies, since last year, and I don't see enough of these young people at the rallies. And I think that it's important. I think that's important that they participate.
Yeah.
And every time I do see a young person, and they're very far and few between, I say thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for everybody, no matter what side, or you just have to be involved.
Thank you so much. What a great last comment. Some intergenerational solidarity. And so, yes, walking the talk, super important. It is a kind of fitness issue. Use it or lose it. We're so grateful to Etan especially for coming out to chatting with us about things that can be done and that you're doing. And, of course, to my wonderful colleagues, Professor Eisenberg, Professor Fritz. Please join me in thanking them.